All right, so now we should be recording. So let me first of all share my screen. So for those who are joining the recording, welcome everybody. And today we'll be talking about a particular part of the SAMM model, being this security requirements security practice. Can everybody see my screen? I hope you can with the model. Yes, is that
yes.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So as with every security practice in the SAMM 2.0 model, we have two streams that are part of security requirements. One stream is about actual definition of software requirements, and the second stream is about supplier security. The idea of the security requirements practice is, of course, to elicit and to notate, to formalize in some way requirements that are relevant for the software that you're building or that you're acquiring, to make sure that it's clear to everybody involved in the project what is actually expected from a security point of view. And so we are tackling two dimensions. One is the software requirements, so everything that should be realized in the software that you're building or that you're buying. And the second one is everything that you're expecting from suppliers that are somehow involved in building software or delivering the software. So let's first dive into the software requirements, stream A. As you all are aware, we always have 3 maturity levels for this. So looking into software requirements, so the most basic level at the level 1 would be trying to come up in I would say in a rather pragmatic way with some relevant security requirements for your software. So based on the functionality of your application that you're building or that you want to acquire, thinking about, okay, what might be relevant in terms of security requirements. Clearly, this will have links with things like threat assessment, the security practice that we discussed last month, because it will give you insight in what can go wrong in the software. But it might also be linked to particular policies, regulations within the company or on a broader level, national level or international level that you might want to adhere to. And so here the idea is to, again, in a pragmatic way, try to formulate let's say a minimal set of security requirements that would be relevant to realize within the piece of software. Building security requirements is I would say not always that easy, because getting security requirements right in terms of the completeness and the formalization or how you specify security requirements is not a very it can be a challenge, I would put it like that. So in this case, at maturity level 1, you do really a best effort of getting some security requirements on paper and making sure that they are relevant. That would be a level 1. We do mention the fact that they should be smart security requirements, so that they should be measurable, they should be actionable. You're probably familiar with the smartness of requirements. Of course, this also applies to this, but we don't enforce it at the level 1. It's just piece of advice, I would say. Then going at the level 2, there actually we want to increase the completeness of the security requirements, and we want to also increase the crispness or the correctness of the security requirements in the way they are specified. So we're looking at both making sure that the elicitation of security requirements is done in a more structured manner, by making sure that you know that you're analyzing different sources of requirements. So you look into functionality of the software, for instance, you look into relevant policies, you look into regulations that might apply, and you make sure that you take into account the different sources of this of potential security requirements, and that you do it always in a structured manner, to avoid that you miss half of the requirements, and to really put the focus on the completeness of security requirements. And in the same line, we also want to put the focus on the way you formalize these requirements, and so that we're putting focus on the notation, on a more structured notation of security requirements there. So at the level 1, they can be very, they can be described in a very natural language, I would say. On a level 2, you might want to start using particular formalisms to describe security requirements, to make sure that it's always clear. And you can think about formalisms like the form of, as user X, I want to make sure that I can execute this type of functionality, this kind of a bit more structured notations. There are different ways in which you can structure that notation, but you want to think about how you want to describe the security requirements. And then is there another thing to mention for this level 2? And if there's any questions or remarks, don't hesitate to interrupt. Yeah, and then we also give some indication or some advice about making sure that the requirements are actually taken into account during product development or product acquisition, by applying annotations or priorities, or making sure that they're catered for in the other activities. That's level 2 for the security requirements part. And then at the level 3, we're talking about yet another advancement in the way you treat security requirements within the organization. And that is really setting up like security requirements frameworks. So the idea is there that you define a framework of reusable security requirements, making sure that you have a good notation that's to describe the requirements, making sure that the completeness is there, but also making sure that you have a set of reusable requirements. You very often see that it's, when you look at project teams, that it's not really always very clear what security requirements, what good security requirements would be, whether they have enough security requirements, where they would get these security requirements. This level 3 is really about making sure that you have a framework in place that helps the project teams to elicit these requirements, and as a starting point with a set of reusable security requirements. It's something that I've seen in some organizations, but it's not so easy to achieve in a good manner, in my opinion, this level 3. So I would be really interested to hear your experiences for the different maturity levels 1, 2, and 3. If you have any experience that you want to share on the record in this matter. But so for security requirements, these are the 3 levels that we define in the SAMM model. So leaving the floor open here, are there any thoughts, questions, experience that you want to share on this?
Well, not so much experience, but I'm also wondering what kind of methods, if there's any new methods that have been developed. I mean, I'm approaching the topic mostly from a like security testing perspective most of the time, so much from requirements. But I remember that years ago, this was with Gary McGraw with these abuse cases. That was one technique that was used some time ago, but I don't know if, I think I still have the book here, so probably can show that in the camera. But but yeah, the question is really like, are there any more recent or methods of gathering security requirements? That's something yeah. Here's the, I don't know if you can see that. It's probably not sharp, but somewhere here is the abuse cases in the, and I always thought that's quite, the idea being that you have your use cases, that how you would plan this. I mean, nowadays probably more stories that you want to implement, but then also kind of stories about how somebody would abuse the software and then build security around that. So
yeah. Well, I think you always have like the what I would call the positive side security requirements, and then the negative side security requirements. Negative side is more like the abuse. Positive side is what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
And this is always two dimensions that you have to look into. To me, the abuse cases come quite close to threat modeling, and so thinking about the negative behavior of an application, whether you want to do it to threat modeling or to abuse case analysis. I think they are quite linked. It's not exactly the same, but they are quite linked. You can build attack trees, you can do threat modeling, you can do abuse case analysis. It's always thinking about what can go wrong. Now, the point for me in thinking about what can go wrong is to afterwards distill relevant security requirements out of there, right? And so whether you prefer to do attack tree analysis or threat modeling or abuse case analysis, to me, the goal is always the same, coming up with negative behavior that you can then turn into security requirements. And I think it depends a bit on the experience in the organization and what works well, what doesn't work well. I personally, I've seen the tree being used in organizations, and I don't personally have a strong preference that one technique would be way better than the other techniques to come up with this negative behavior. I think it really depends a bit on what works well with the people, what's their experience, what have they done before, and what not.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a good, I think, still a good discussion that these are tied to whatever the way you do it. Like if you do attack trees or abuse cases, and then the security requirements are then tied to that.
Yes, indeed.
Whatever you use as a starting point.
Yeah.
So to jump in a little bit, just to, a little bit of a spoiler, abuse cases are specifically addressed in the SAMM model under the security testing practice. So that's where it's basically saying as you're building the maturity of your security testing practices, get things more regularized, more consistent. If you're not already doing it, introduce abuse cases or negative test cases, whichever label you prefer. The key thing in this particular practice where it's talking about, the system requirements, in my opinion, and the way that I usually talk about it is that there's kind of this path forward through threat assessment to consequential security requirements. So basically, if you're in a relatively immature organization that doesn't already have a bunch of standard security requirements, going through a threat assessment process using any consistent assessment process, whether it's show stack style threat modeling or attack tree analysis or whatever, as you start to look at the functional requirements for the system, then if you don't already have anything, then you can start adding in the security functional and non-functional requirements by saying, yes, and in order to make that functional feature secure, we also need these things. And so, as Bart talked about, this practice is talking about getting to the point where you have a consistent practice. You're starting to have repeatable, reusable requirement formats and requirement definitions, so that you're not developing them from scratch for every new system.
Yeah, and indeed, whatever we do in terms of abuse case analysis or attack tree analysis, the goal is always to come to these positive security requirements, what you want to achieve. So one way of getting there is that negative analysis and then turn it into a positive. The other way is also really thinking about, indeed, so what is the functionality that the software does and how do I want to protect that? And then you typically come to, yeah, well, security is all about confidentiality, integrity, availability. You can think of it on functionality or on data. You might want to protect the function of an application. You might want to protect data of an application. And so in every use case of an application, you can think about, okay, how do we want to enforce this confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that function, of that data, and yeah, relevant to the functionality that you're looking at. And that is another way of eliciting security requirements, and it's really describing what should be enforced in terms of that confidentiality, integrity, availability, and how can you specify that? And that, for instance, sometimes is being done if you look at by for instance doing access control matrices or something like describing who can have access to that function and under what role or to what degree. Describing that per function is a way of describing security requirements. You can apply the same to data access, for instance, or making sure that security requirements in terms of non-repudiation, making sure that you cannot deny afterwards that you done something, where relevant, because it's not always that relevant, but where relevant, you can describe that you need to ensure that non-repudiation is being implemented or is being applied to that particular functionality. So that's not starting from the negative side of things, but starting from what do I want to achieve in terms of security behavior in that application. And that analysis you would typically do starting from the functionality of the application, and then thinking about what security properties do I want to enforce on that functionality. And you can do that in a pragmatic way. But you can also do it in a more structured way. Eh? So for every function in the application or for every interface in the application, you can really start thinking about, okay, what are the security properties that I want to enforce on this function or on this interface or on this integration? It's really about making it more structured on level 2. On level 1 is more like in a pragmatic way. And it's often the combination of the two that brings you to normally a good set of security requirements that you can then further work with to support implementation, but also definitely to support testing. Because the better the security requirements are, the better it will be. You can test whether they're actually the security is at an appropriate level in your software. Does that make sense, Karsten?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was more like I just want to get some, I don't know, feel for what people think about it. So, right. Yeah, I mean, another thing that I'm not so close to current like development. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, but I'm also wondering how this works in like a agile or scrum way, how you would build that into your, you know, if you sort of build your backlog or sprint or something, and then when you build it into your plan for when to implement what kind of functionality function, So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, we don't have the situation that we just, you know, plan everything and then, and so you could, yeah. So I guess there's the question of what takes priority and when to come to this point to implement these,
Yeah.
or to make sure that they are covered.
Yeah. Now
Guess what? I have an opinion about that too.
Yeah. Go ahead, John.
So the approach that we've actually adopted and that I'm guiding some of our development teams to adopt and improve is basically I took, you can go and find this talk. There's Izar Tarandok has done the talk Threat Model at Every Story a couple of different times. I know there's a good recording of it from AppSec Cali a couple of years ago. And now I don't use the specific procedure that he talks about, but the idea is if you're starting, you know, a greenfield project and you're doing an iterative release, iterative delivery, user story based development, then the point is to derive your consequential security requirements for each story. And because those security requirements have been arrived at to say, in order to have that function be secure when delivered, these additional security requirements are necessary, then they become part of the definition of done for the original story. And so that way, like the first time that you introduce the ability for a website to let customers modify anything, then you say, oh, well, now we need to deal with authentication and authorization to make sure that they can only change the things they're allowed to change. Up until that point, you haven't had any functionality that required auth-Z and auth-N. So if you haven't already built it, it now becomes a precondition for that new feature.
Yeah.
Now, when you're starting with an enterprise that has an existing application framework, and you've got existing identity and authentication federation, and there's a lot of stuff that you're just jumping into, then often that means you don't have to do new development other than say, oh, this is the point where we need to make sure we're correctly integrated with the federated identity service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, Karsten, I think you were indeed also referring to well, the tension between functionality and security, and the choice for priorities on that. I think John raised a very valid point in saying that, okay, because of dependencies, you automatically inherit some of the requirements that you're kind of forced to implement before you can actually complete a particular story. Now, if you look at use case modeling, I think the security requirements that we're talking about here will also be represented in different levels of user stories, because you might have a user story for authentication, for instance, and that would probably be relevant as a user story in its own, while having, like, let's say, an access control matrix, or defining who can access what function in a piece of software, is probably part of a user story of that functionality. So if you say, okay, I want to have a use case or a user story about being able to prepare a money transfer, something like that, then you probably want to describe in that user story who can execute that function and under which conditions. And that is not a user story, a separate user story, but it becomes part of the conditions of successfully completing that user story. So some of the requirements are actually part of those user stories. And if they are, there is not a game to be played about which comes first, because you cannot implement that user story if you didn't implement those particular security requirements that are part of that user story as well. So my point is a bit the game that is played between which has priority is played at different levels, and if you represent security requirements, you also have to think about where are they best represented to make sure that well they also come out fairly, I would say, in a priority game, if you see my point.
Mm-hmm.
And the game of choosing between security and functionality is mostly played at the user story level. But once you dive into user stories, well, you either implement user story or you don't. It's not that you can say, I'm going to implement it half.
Yeah.
So if you have security requirements that are part of that user story as a definition of done or something, then they will be implemented no matter what. Otherwise, the user story is not implemented correctly. So it's really something to think about. What's the best way? So you can represent these security requirements at different levels, and thinking about what's the best level to represent a particular security requirements. It's important to think about that, because it will avoid a lot of these difficult discussions of is the functionality more important than security, or vice versa. And these are sometimes tough discussions to be held.
Right. I think one aspect of this to point out, and it's a little bit of a rehash of last month's deep dive, but the idea in a threat modeling practice, or however you're going about identifying, what your consequential requirements are, a decision not to implement some specific security feature needs to be a risk-based decision. So as you're talking about that friction between functionality and security, there needs to be the risk-based conversation to make sure that the business owner, the risk owner for the system, is okay with not implementing a security feature before the team's allowed to drop it from the definition of done. Instead of saying, oh, well, we'll implement that security feature later because we want the shiny new feature now. That's not their call. If it's been identified that the way we're going to mitigate the threats against a particular feature is by implementing this prerequisite security function, then the feature can't be released until the security function is also present and working, unless the risk owner has said that they're happy with the residual risk that exists because they chose not to implement the function. But at that point, because it's been risk-based and the risk owner has accepted it, then the development team can say, okay, it is not a prerequisite. We can go ahead and implement this feature despite the lack of security functionality. And the risk owner said it was okay. Classic example I talk about all the time is file upload. I mean, well, we just need to get file upload working. We'll worry about security later. Is the risk owner okay with that?
Yeah.
Anybody, any other opinion or things you want to share about this discussion? Just an open call. Okay, I think that's a no at this point. Maybe you can still comment later if we stop the recording as well. So Kirsten, is that okay as an?
Yeah, I think it's good discussion. Interesting insights. Yeah, and also, right. I mean, I was just holding my horses here because it was like you could go on forever, but I didn't want to. In the interest of time, I think you still should have some time to go into the supplier
right
requirements.
So indeed, let's then move there. And we go into the second stream, which is supplier security. There, the idea is to look at, okay, suppliers that are involved in development or delivery of the software, are there any expectations in terms of security towards them? And that's what the stream B is about. So if we look at that stream, again, we have 3 maturity levels. Level 1, at the level 1, you want to look at, you want to get a basic understanding of the security posture of the suppliers that you're working with. So suppose you're acquiring a piece of software, or you're licensing a SaaS solution, or you have an outsourced development party that helps you implementing that piece of software. You would have discussions with that supplier to try to understand, okay, how do they deal with risk and security, and do they have somehow their act together? It can be based on a checklist, it can be based on some discussions, but it's to get a feeling of, okay, do they know what they're talking about, and do they have it under control, or is it really about they have no clue what they're talking about, and we should be really worried about security of what they're doing? So that would be a level 1 activity. Level 2 activity is then more about, okay, we know that you as a supplier are looking into security, but can we formalize that a bit more? So suppose something bad comes out of what has been delivered by a supplier, or they're facing an incident, or you need something to be fixed in whatever they've produced. Is there some service level agreements? Who is responsible for what? Is it part of the contract that you've defined with that supplier, or is it based on exceptions, or how do you deal with that? Making that more clear, more explicit on an agreement level, but also on a contractual level, that's the focus of level 2 in this security practice, or in this stream. So making it more formalized and making sure who is responsible, making clear who is responsible for what can we expect under particular situations, who is going to do what, and how and when. That's more the focus of level 2. And then level 3 is about trying to integrate as much as possible the collaboration between you as a company and the suppliers that you're working with, of course, with the focus on security. Yeah? But so let's say, for instance, you have your own development stack and your development tools, and the supplier is developing part of the software that you're building and also has its own development stack, development tools. You might think about trying to align as much as possible the different tools that are being used, like code repositories, build tools, development, deployment environments, and others. So trying to align and to integrate as much as possible where it's feasible, where you can, the suppliers and your own environments. So rather than just pointing out responsibilities, level 3 goes a step further and tries to actually integrate the environments to make sure that you have under control what should be happening for security and when it goes wrong. Basically, that would be the level 3 of supplier security. All right. Any thoughts on this? Any questions with regards to supplier security? Any experiences that you might have had in discussions with different suppliers in your particular context?
So Bart, to
Yes.
start off, we have an issue on GitHub regarding this, so maybe we can address that now.
Sure.
We have someone talk about the quality, one of the quality criteria that we have. So if you can scroll down there, yeah, for maturity level 3. So the vendor has a secure SDLC that includes secure build, secure deployment, defect management, and incident management that align with those used in your organization. Our user here says, I do not think the vendor's SDLC practices necessarily have to align with those used in your organization, as your organization may be of a lesser maturity and vendors may have many customers with varying processes. As an indication of maturity of the vendor, I would suggest a criterion along the lines of: the vendor has a secure SDLC that includes secure build, secure deployment, defect management, and incident management, and is able to demonstrate operating effectiveness of practices. He says the criterion has to be independent of my own organization practices, and he says he's happy to hear our thoughts on this.
All right. That is, I think, a very valid comment. I think it depends, in my opinion, it depends how far you want to push this. Because in my opinion, demonstrating operational effectiveness is a step before alignment. So for me, operational effectiveness would be a minimum for this level 3. And actually, I'm wondering whether it's actually not part of earlier maturity levels or low maturity levels already. In a sense that, well, if you're trusting a supplier to behave appropriately or to have appropriate security practices, that's actually what you assess at the level 1. That's actually where you put agreements on the collaboration in level 2. So having operational effectiveness, for me, it's really for me, it's a minimum, and well, I think it's a good point, but I'm not, well, I think what we want to say here is that we might want to go a step further than just proving that it's operationally effective. So, well, I think it's a good suggestion, and it's definitely open for discussion. I think at the level 3, what we typically try to do is level 3 in the SAMM model is not something that you can easily get. It's really a situation where you really have things really under control. So, and you will see that for other security practices as well. Sometimes these level 3 criteria are hard to achieve. What I do think here is that alignment is definitely harder to achieve than operational effectiveness. Now, I don't think we want to say with this alignment, and that's my opinion, other people might differ in opinion. I don't think that we want to say here is that all your suppliers and yourself should all use the same, should all be fully aligned in terms of tools, in terms of process. I don't think that's really that's really our goal. If you can achieve that, that would be great. But I think in reality, it will be very difficult to achieve that. But it's making sure that you somehow are, well, you somehow have under control also, or understand what's happening at the supplier's level. So I think it's a matter of finding the, well, what is the minimum that we expect in this maturity level 3 from understanding what's happening at the supplier side. That's a bit my take on it. I don't think it's a definitive answer to this, and I'd be very interested to hear other opinions as well.
Well, that was the comment I was going to raise, Bart, is that aligned with is not the same as, or aligned with does not mean the same as. So
Exactly.
a way to look at that is that their practices need to be at least mature enough to give you all of the inputs and respond to all of your outputs appropriately.
Exactly. Yeah.
They might be much more mature than you are, but because they are even more mature, they're easily able to give you everything you need in order to have them just kind of align with, slot into your processes. If they're relatively immature, then they'll have a hard time doing that.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Does that make sense? Any people with opposing opinions on this? Sometimes I think it's a fair comment, and sometimes it really depends on the interpretation of the wording that we're using as well. So I think here the matter is that, and I think you worded it very well, John. With alignment, we don't want to say that it's the same, but they are aligned. So if you need something, they can deliver. If they need something, you can deliver, and it all fits well together. That's what we're aiming for here. So that's maybe well, but it's an issue on GitHub, right?
It is.
Yeah. Okay.
So
then,
maybe we can then rewatch this, summarize it, and reply.
Exactly.
Or
and then
can,
yeah, that provide that as an answer, and then see whether it makes sense to the person that created the issue, or that he still has a strong objection, and then let's try to understand more why. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could, I guess, go on for longer. I mean, another question that is, how does, I mean, we're talking about suppliers here in a supplier relationship where you have an existing relationship with a third party, right? But how does like open source as in the supply chain play into this? Would be another question to discuss. How does, supply chain, software supply chain attacks are a big topic, which I don't know, doesn't always help to have aligned processes when the attack is not coming from the supplier directly, but somebody attacking the supplier. And so yeah, so I think there's more things that could be discussed here.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe first addressing the second topic. In terms of software supply chain, I think there are two dimensions to this. A first dimension is if you would have, well, the first dimension is more like the technical dependency dimension. Let me start with that one. So, well, a typical issue with software supply chain is also having dependencies in your software, and these dependencies get integrated, and yeah, you can also have all sorts of negative effects based on that. Now, that is actually a stream of its own in the model, and it's part of the secure build, if I remember correctly, security practice, which treats the entire...
Yeah, no, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
It's still also from a requirement perspective.
Sure.
So.
And that brings me to the second part. But so if you're really talking about dependencies on its own, we have a separate stream about that, and definitely it's relevant to look into that. But if you look at well, a supplier being attacked, and then that might have a negative effect of some sort on software that you're building. Actually, it's part of the risk model of the supplier. And so the three levels that we're talking about should take that into account and should evaluate whether the risk of such an event happening is relevant or not, and what the supplier does to protect against that. So in that type of threat is a very relevant threat, but it's actually part of what we're trying to aim at in this stream. It's maybe not explicitly mentioned, but for me, it is really part of what we're trying to achieve here in this stream.
Mhm.
And we might make it more explicit. I don't know if it's not explicit enough, we might think about making that more explicit, but for me it's really part of what we're trying to achieve. And then talking about open source, that's of course also a very relevant question or remark. But the fact that something is open source, well, has its own set of risks, and also that needs to be evaluated according to the risk that it faces towards the organization. Now, I think you will have a hard time defining SLAs with open source projects, and that's where it becomes a bit tricky. But in general, thinking about risk of an open source project is similar to thinking about risk of an enterprise. It's just some of the expectations that you might have and some of the alignments maybe that you might have. Although in terms of alignment, open source projects are typically very open in how they're organized. So you could think about, does this align with what I do expect from that supplier, being an open source supplier? So in terms of alignment, I think it might be easier than talking to a commercial company, but in terms of SLAs, it's definitely a challenge, and I don't have a ready-made answer there, but it's definitely something to consider. Now it's not that you can't define an SLA, that it might not be sufficient for what you need. But if you're talking about really a very a key a crown jewel piece of software in your organization, then you really might want to consider whether involving open source projects is the right thing to do for that crown jewel application. And it's not a judgment, it's just something to think about for a crown jewel application, because when things fall down and you have to rely on that open source project to fix some of the core part of your crown jewel application, you might have a hard time. And it's part of the risk discussion for that project to be done, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And it's certainly valid when you're discussing SLAs with a vendor who's delivering software to you, to include their SLAs for responding to updates and regular updates, and particularly security updates to dependencies they're introducing into your ecosystem. So, you know, if they've brought in an open source library as part of what they deliver to you, and then that open source library has, you know, a critical security fix, what is their SLA for adapting their delivered software to use the fixed version of that library?
Talking from experience on that side, on the vendor side, this is something we see happening very, very often. So we are held accountable for the open source or third-party libraries that we have baked into our products. So it's often part of an RFP or the purchase.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense to me. If you're delivering a piece of software as a company, well, you're reliable, you're accountable for whatever is necessary to deliver that piece of software. And if you as a company choose to include a lot of open source libraries in there, well, it's a strategic decision. But then of course you also have to well, take into account the risks or the events that might happen while you still need to deliver your piece of software to your customers. So I think it's a very, it's a normal, well, I think it's logical to request that as a customer. And then you come into the entire bill of material types of discussions when delivering pieces of software, and what are the licenses linked to that, and well, software composition analysis, that comes into play then.
Mhm.
All right, gentlemen, I think we're 50 minutes over time. So what I would suggest is that we stop our discussions here. We'll also stop the recording. And we can definitely have some other chats over the Slack channel or via other means. But I wanna, I wouldn't dare to take much more of your day's time because the discussions might continue to go on. I think we covered the essence of these this security practice, these two streams. I hope we did. And thanks everybody for contributing to the discussion here. And if there's any other things that you are faced with, don't have a clear answer, I would invite everybody to put it on the Slack channel and to start the discussions there.
Just before we leave, there is a comment.
Well, I
A
can
question for John D.
Can I stop recording here, or should I still continue
Oh,
recording?
no. Okay.
What?
You can stop if it's
All
for
right.
me. I'm just before we leave, so we don't lose this question because it's
All
on the
right.
chat, and it was for John D.
Yes.
So this shouldn't be on the recording. Is John still with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Have you seen the question? Because you
Yeah, I
mentioned
just looked at it.
Okay, so maybe we can reply on the Slack channel, because I think Chris, who asked the question, has already left.
Okay.